What do you think, Harold? Welcome to Raven Diaries Part 5, How Did Birds Evolve? Here, I'll share some of my observations and try to answer some of the more common questions I get from people concerning the ravens. For those who haven't seen any of the previous episodes, or at least Part 1, this entire group of short stories stems from our love of caring for wounded animals. One year, we had a relationship with a wounded crow named Bob, and then weeks after, we raised a baby raven we named Huey. We successfully returned him to the wild. I made a picture book for my nieces and nephews, and then a short film for friends and family. All through the entire process, people asked and continue to ask many questions about the birds. What's the difference between crows and ravens was by far the number one question. Other questions were too involved to answer in the field and usually dealt with how, where, why, or do you think birds evolved? This was an interesting question to me because of the controversy of whether the birds evolved from dinosaurs. In grade school, I read all I could about dinosaurs, and by 9 I knew all the names and loved to draw pictures of them. Here's a favorite, green T-Rex. I also got a lot of questions about the intelligence of ravens, and both questions and statements on brain size. My favorite questions came from those who actually stood next to me as I was shooting. See, this is a crow here. You hear him cawing? Size, mostly. Size, movement, and tail configuration. And if there were any other birds, sea lions, or dolphins in the area, the discussions even got more interesting. Curiosity kills me, and I love the inner workings of things. All through school, science was my favorite subject and still is to this day. I prefer hands-on learning by experimentation. That's just one reason why Huey, our raven, was an over-the-top experience. We got to raise him up before he had fledged and flew, and then we watched him go wild.
Hello there. Hello there. Huey, what are you doing?
Right from the beginning, we were amazed how fast and thoroughly Huey imprinted. That is, how fast he adopted, recognized, and responded to us as his parents. But as time went on, what was more amazing to me was the way he reacted to the world around him. His reaction to hawks was especially intriguing. Allow me to repeat a story from the beginning. The very first day Huey actually flew on his own, my heart sank as I watched him sitting on the roof, obviously recovering from the awkward amount of flapping he had to do to get up there. Within seconds, a feisty Cooper's hawk, a well-known bird hunter about the size of a crow, came over and started attacking Huey. There was nothing I could do but watch, and I truly thought Huey was a goner. But he stood his ground, and with every attack the hawk made, Huey made counterattacks. This was the same day I ended up chasing Huey all over the neighborhood, and the same day he got mauled by the 2 small dogs. But here's where it gets interesting, because a few days later we were playing on the roof, and all of a sudden he stopped and crouched down low. I looked around and I saw nothing. Then 5 seconds later, the same type of hawk went speeding off, and Huey went off to chase it out of his neighborhood. Instinctively he knew foe. Instinctively he knew territory. Instinctively he knew chase it out of here, it doesn't belong here. Now let's stop for a second. Diane and I raised Huey well before he could fly. So how and why would he behave like this, and why does this wild raven you're watching do the same thing? First, there's specific recognition here. How? Second, how does he know this bird doesn't belong here? Third, why would he chase it out of a specifically defined territory he's only been flying in for a couple of days? In part 1, Huey recognized a live mouse Diana had gotten him. He immediately pounced on it, killed it, tore it up, and ate it as if he had done it before. But he hadn't done it before. I also shared how Huey figured out how to not only let the neighbor's dogs out, but then he would close them out of the yard so that he could safely steal their food. Then there's the French fry story, where Huey specifically took the fries, rearranged them in his mouth so they were visible, and then waited patiently for the crows to go overhead so he could fly up in the middle of them and taunt them so they would dive at him trying to get the fries. That's a type of plan ahead, lie in wait, purposeful teasing that's pretty hard to explain in the current scientific theories. Can you say, just for fun? When I started getting involved with the wild birds, I was more amazed to find similar versions of all these stories and more. Why? Because all these things involve a concept I think is extremely important when it comes to scientific inquiry, and that is the concept of recognition. What does something have to do to recognize something?
Hi, guys. Well, hi there. Hi. Good morning. Aren't you looking good? You're starting to get back your down, aren't you? Hi there. How are you, huh? You gonna talk to me this morning? Hello? Hello? We did the whole United States right in the sand.
There has to be some sort of pre-knowledge in the first place. Where could this knowledge have come from? Could the parents have passed it down through the genes? If so, how? We tend to call this instinct, but how is instinct passed down generation to generation? And why are specific things passed down in some animals and not in others? For example, both the ostrich and the penguin live just fine, even though they are birds and they can't fly. A crow who can't fly cannot survive long in the wild. In fact, most birds have to fly to survive. In school, I learned the highest evolved animal is man. Now, if we are the highest evolved beings on the planet, why do we have to learn almost everything? For instance, why, if you came from a long line of barrel makers, don't you automatically have the instincts to make barrels? Why aren't some of these functions passed down generation to generation by a process of evolution, when in supposedly lower creatures it is? Anyone who studies birds can tell me he knows by the shape of a nest what kind of bird made that nest. Now, he had to learn that, but the bird made the nest by instinct, and each bird nest has its own signature for their specific style of nest. Somehow it's passed down from generation to generation. Now, my great-grandfather knew French and math, so why don't I instinctively know French and math? It's these concepts and others that make me question the abilities and limits of many of our current scientific theories. Specific starts, stops, and defined limitations are everywhere in nature. In fact, many are so locked in, even with all the tinkering we can muster, we can't budge them. For over 100 years we've been messing with fruit flies. We've done just about everything we know we can do to them, and yet we still have just fruit flies. Why are these limitations there? How could they be there in the first place? It seems nobody really knows. Or do they? Today, biologists are actually looking at computer scientists to help them see this concept a little better. What happens when you stick a disk into a disk drive? The first thing the hard drive does is look to see if it can recognize what's on the disk. And this is fascinating. It doesn't matter whether the disk is empty or completely full of information. The disk itself weighs exactly the same. That's because the information on the disk weighs nothing. And here's something else I find quite fascinating. Information doesn't need matter to exist. Information is on its own. Information uses matter for storage, sharing, and for demonstrating ideas. Now, everybody knows that for a disk to be recognized, there has to be a pre-written code that can be recognized. And somebody had to physically put that code there. You couldn't convince a computer programmer it just happened over time. Yet in all life, we see far more complex codes have been written. I naturally wonder how. How could this vast amount of incredibly detailed information have been written, received, stored, read, and the directions followed by tiny little inanimate micro machines? Before I go on, allow me to put one more picture in your mind. In my world, if you believe that just flour, egg, water, sugar, and time, you'd eat cake, you'd be wrong. Why? Because it doesn't happen. Somebody's got to mix it, and somebody's got to bake it. This is a simple, logical, and reasonable scientific conclusion. And yet, all through my studies in biology, we were forced to ignore this simple concept. Why? Many times when I was out taping, people would ask me questions about bird evolution. I always wanted to ask, evolved? How? Evolved from what? Two things bother me about this question. Understand, I am part of the last generation where creation by God was generally accepted in public schools, and the idea of evolution over long periods of time was an unproven theory. In fact, here in California, it wasn't until 1962 that it became mandatory for the evolutionary curriculum to be taught in public schools. To this day, I remember my second grade teacher's reaction. Even so, opposing discussions were fair game up through high school. But things changed almost overnight as I reached junior college, and by the mid-70s it was pure evolution in all my biology, marine science, and oceanography classes. It amazed me how fast this topic had become a scientific dogma with no discussion allowed. So from my angle, it's kind of like a group of Canadian college students who have crashed a classic French class and succeeded in shouting down all the opposition. Let's just say I'm a little baffled as to why are some of the educated elite of the world choosing to take obvious metaphysical properties in the name of science. For example, to believe that in nature things continue to improve and get better by some yet undiscovered process when that very idea goes against everything we know. Furthermore, why do they dogmatically parade it to be the only option and then get frustrated because many of us see this as a magic show, not science? Let them eat cake? Or not? Now, why is this subject such a big deal? Well, because quite frankly, when you really look closely at a bird, any bird, you just have to stand back in awe and wonder at everything that makes them so unique.
Yes, and so the body structure of a bird is very different from a mammal. Their bone structure is very different. They have lots of air.
And then I look at specifics. One-way lungs and air sacs evolved. Hollow bones. Feathers. First off, a bird knows to preen. Now think about that for a moment. Do you have any idea how different the world would be if human children knew instinctively the importance of keeping oneself clean and tidy? Do you realize how much calmer women the world over would be if children went and just bathed, washed their hands, and brushed their teeth on their own? And yet, all the other animals in the world do this instinctively. But we don't. Why? The incredible complexity of a feather is mind-boggling. The way they lock and unlock, each individual feather rotating so the air moves through them and around them, creating numerous vortexes or mini hurricanes for both lift and control. We can't duplicate anything close. And then we get into flight. A bird learns to fly? You know, I gotta say right here, I think we just take too much for granted. Because think about this for a minute. Us highly evolved beings with an absolute minimum of at least 5,000 years of recorded written history, have only produced immovable wings that aren't even attached to our bodies, so we can just get pushed or pulled as we soar more than actually fly. In what, the last 100 years of our existence? And nothing we produce can do anything near what a bird can do. And when we take the time to watch ravens, we see it's far more than just flying. It's play and showtime. And then we have hummingbirds? Evolved? Evolved from what? Our current story is dinosaurs, but we've seen this before in my day, and it was the evolutionary horsey story. You don't see it much anymore. You know why? Because it's just not true. Scientists made the mistake of believing a history that was rewritten by a small group in our great-grandfather's day, specifically to fit the theories they wanted to be true. The problem is, if you don't learn from history, you repeat it. And if you write a history that never existed, that makes matters even worse. The dino to bird bit is just another horsey story, and it's not just my opinion. Most of the critique comes from within the scientific community itself. There are plenty of fully developed birds deeper in the layers of the supposed geological column than the supposed dinosaurs the birds came from. And that brings up another interesting subject. My travels to film the birds has taken me all over some of the world's finest open displays of the geological column. Grand Canyon, Bryce, the Painted Desert, even my back bay in Newport, and I see it while waiting on my buddies down at Crystal Cove and Laguna. I love to look at all the different types of layers that have been deposited, stacked, and settled there. Funny, all by water. Interesting enough, I started paying extra attention to this subject in 1982 when my wife and I spent 6 months bicycling all through Europe on what I'd call a self-paid sabbatical. One of my goals was to visit all the wine regions of France and other parts of Europe to see, taste, and experience firsthand what made each of those regions unique. It didn't hit me until I was there, listening and tasting and hearing from those who tilled the soil, grew the grapes, and made the wine, that many of the great regions like Chablis, where some of the world's greatest and most expensive Chardonnay comes from, and Champagne, where the absolute greatest wines with bubbles originates, it's the calcium from seashells that give these wines their incredible complexity and uniqueness. Seashells? In the middle of France? Mais oui, from the flood, you know, the flood of Noah. It covered Earth, and it covered France too, the French would say, with a special look of French pride. It was these and many other stories like it, by people who worked and lived in the land, that helped me see the effects of Noah's flood all over Europe. In fact, I was surprised there wasn't much scuba diving off the coast of Italy and Greece, and then I found out why. They didn't want you to loot the buried cities. Currently, the diving world is abuzz with all the buried cities newly discovered off many coasts, including India, Cuba, Africa, Japan, and more. Buried cities? Have you heard about these? My interest in Noah's flood was renewed by the numerous trips we took to film the birds all over the western United States. I look with wonder at the many miles of layers in the Grand Canyon, and it looks as though a cake was perfectly stacked. And even though it's claimed there are long periods of time in between, there doesn't seem to be any erosion between the layers themselves. As a surfer, I'm also very aware of the strength and movement of water. As you can see, it's the suction from the pooling of water and leaving rapidly that makes these patterns an instant canyon-like formation. This looks a lot more like Grand Canyon or Bryce from the air, whereas a river cuts more like this. Then there are other times when the birds run off and leave me and I'm all by myself for a while in a quiet canyon or gorge. And that's when I see areas with folds in the layers. In this case, a perfect Z, and I can't help wonder how. How could these layers stack on top of each other, harden over time, and then bend all together without cracking? Unless it was actually done very quickly and the bending occurred before the layers harden. All of these layers were laid down by water, and how many local floods do scientists really think there were? These questions and many more like them are not answered by the long-age theories I learned in school. They seem to be better answered by the one flood that most ancient civilizations seem to record. I'm beginning to wonder how many horsey stories are really out there. I think these things are important to look at because many important decisions are made based on this newly written history. People forget that in 1974, the headline said we were headed for an ice age and that millions would die before the year 2000. Today it's global warming. Is it? I wonder. Our current population, the saltiness of the ocean, erosion, things that I studied, and many things I look at and see in the world lead me to believe that the writings of most ancient civilizations that record one huge recent flood that covered all the world and left a few people alive is probably correct. That there was one ice age that stretched and receded a number of times but reached a peak and has been warming up ever since. Buried cities, anyone? I'm convinced science's historical rewrite is wrong. Things happen much faster than they previously believed. Perhaps we should look at global warming in a new light, and instead of hoping science and technology will save us, we should begin to prepare for it. The Katrina model comes to mind. As you can see, my birds end up getting me involved in the world in ways I never would have dreamed.
Hi there. Hi there.
Now, speaking of instincts, how many of you have the instincts to go absolutely ballistic over these and similar subjects? Fortunately, wisdom has taught me I have nothing to worry about, because the truth will always win, even though it seems to be taking its sweet little time. Although I chose not to follow through on my education to become a credentialed biologist, I never gave up my love for biology and the study of life. I love to read, and I keep up with what's going on, and from what I'm seeing, the scientific world is on the brink of a major paradigm shift. Right here and now, our science and technology is leading us in a whole new direction, because the deeper we go, the more we're finding the very essence of life itself is a magnificent manuscript, a pre-written code, if you will, that boggles the very minds that look into it. Today, the world is moving so fast, and the speculative science of our great-grandfathers has no choice but to finally catch up. The age of biology is on its way out, and it will not only be replaced, but overrun by the age of information. That sounds like a wild boast, but do you realize the basis of most of the scientific theories were written before we knew what a cell was? Then we found DNA. Then the genome. The newest news is the entire DNA, RNA, protein motor mess is far more complex than anything they ever dreamed of. Scientists predicted a linear progression, but have found a communal circuitry beyond belief. In the tiniest, almost unimaginable micro-miniature, there are machines that act like commercial airliners, complete with autopilot. These mind-boggling micro-machines land, wait to be loaded, and then take off to a pre-planned destination. But before final arrival, it has to be approved and go through special security zones, which are checked in by other micro-machines. This is absolutely astounding. To describe the system, they want to use words like grids and networks, but they can't because it's even more complex than that. One cell has the complexity of a large city, complete with an airport and postal system. It not only involves a network of DNA, hundreds of different kinds of RNA and proteins, it also includes magnetism, electricity, and complicated intercommunications, all working in a complex relationship. This is going to take quite a while and some whole new equipment that hasn't even been invented yet to figure out how all this could be possible in the first place. Now this is exciting. And understand, back in 1859, Darwin knew many would find exactly the opposite of what he was proposing. Dr. Wallace Smith, a holder of 3 doctorates in physical, organic chemistry, and pharmacology sciences, falsified evolution scientifically back in the 70s with numerous books, one of which was called The Creation of Life, a cybernetic approach to evolution. Unfortunately, Dawkins and others managed to shout him down at the time. But mainstream science is finally beginning to see. That's what I read into the evolutionary-based science journals I read. The people doing the real science, the ones involved with the hardcore stuff that talk about evolution and origins, is fading. Why? Well, I'd say it's because it's anybody's guess, or more accurately, nobody wants to, as to how or what or who could have written all this information into these tiny, brainless micromotors, let alone how they could possibly have and share the vast amount of information found in them. It would be like if we found out the Earth was somehow talking to Pluto, and Pluto, following the Earth's directions, was talking to the Moon, telling the Moon how to affect things here on Earth. How is a relationship in inanimate bodies like this possible? So far, the science community falls shy of acknowledging the fact that there's got to be an author to all this. But I'm wondering, how much longer is it going to be before it becomes so overwhelmingly obvious there's no other way to explain it? See, the real science of Bob and Huey has convinced me that the theory of evolution will one day be replaced by the law of relationship. Looking back, that's what this series is really all about. Relationships. My relationship to the birds, their relationship to their environment, and its relationship back to me. Relationship is built into life itself. This is one reason I didn't believe the evolutionary story I was taught in school. The one never made sense. The one couldn't eat. The one couldn't duplicate. The one couldn't be. Life is determined by and built on, and in fact it's completely reliant on, interacting relationships. Look around. What do we see? In the grand scale of things, relationships are the true rock-bottom basis of all life. The Earth wouldn't be a life-supporting planet without its relationship to both the sun and the moon. Flowering plants had to already have the means of pollination, be it bees, birds, etc., or they never would have been. And of course the opposite is true. The bee could not have come about without flowering plants. And when you get into the animals that mate, a single male or female, mated with what to get what? This law is reinforced to me over and over again every time I get out into nature. Why does it continue to be ignored? I look at something like a spider, and we know that this little thing produces different kinds of threads out of the same web-making equipment. Some are sticky and some are not. And just as nobody taught the spider to spin its magnificent web, nobody taught Huey to fly. He flew because he was made to. Think about it. A wing doesn't fly. A tail doesn't fly. Hollow bones don't fly. Specialized lungs don't fly. All those are needed, but in addition, a completed bird must have been pre-programmed in the brain and the muscles to carry out the instructions before you have a flying bird. Ravens are pre-programmed to fly, just like they're pre-programmed to know what to eat, how to mate, and to build a nest the way only ravens do. The Huey Hawk thing, Gus's recognition and reaction to me as seen in the last episode, the French fry story where Huey would specifically set out to tease the crows. These are but some of the many examples I could give that demonstrate to me there's no doubt a raven has their hard drive pre-written to recognize specifics that they would encounter throughout their life. And that's why I believe brain size, which was another question I got in the field, has little to do with intelligence. As we know by our own information storage system, it's not the size but capacity that matters. The raven's intelligence comes from a combination of what was previously written and the fact that the raven has been given the ability to learn. One can easily see by watching some birds are smarter than others. But it's all built into them, and they haven't changed throughout all recorded history. Poor Noah gets absolutely no credit for being a scientist. But what he records is very scientific. Perhaps if Noah had known more about the birds in advance, he would have known better than to release the raven out of the ark. Of course he's going to run off and explore, and there's no way he's coming back for quite a while after being cooped up in that boat all that time. That was the raven's nature then, and it's exactly what I'd expect from a raven today. But doves? Doves have homed since the beginning, because they were made to.
What are you doing?
So how did birds evolve? My studies say they didn't, at least not in the way those asking the questions mean it. Can birds evolve? Yes, and so can a host of other animals we share this incredible planet with. In the next episode, I'll show you how evolution can be demonstrated and why the law of relationship is the greatest law in the universe.
Hi.
I'll also introduce you to the naturalistic experiment that proves there really is life after death. Join us.